And in that environment, investors and central banks will continue to turn to gold and silver as a portfolio diversifier, safe haven investment, a form of currency diversification, an inflation hedge, a hedge against domestic and international political problems. Good morning. It's Jeffrey Christian's CPM Group. It's 11 a.m. Tuesday morning, the 27th of June here in New York. I was going to talk about the People's Bank of China's gold purchases since November and what they really might mean and represent to the market. But I think events in Russia over the weekend have sort of put that aside for now. And we should talk a little bit about Russia and what's going on there, what might go on there in the future, and what it means for precious metals. The slides here are excerpted from a presentation the PDAC asked us to do in 2018 on what were the Russian and Chinese government and population global perspectives. How did they see the world? How do they view the world? How do they view their place in the world? Try not to go into too much of it. Russia has a very strong historical worldview, a very strong national identity. The Russian Empire was one of the largest empires outside of China and India until late in the 19th century. There's a very strong cultural identification of Russian ethnic traditions that spill over the borders of political Russia. And there's a strong cultural identity with the Russian Orthodox Church. They tend to have, or there is a historical collective sense of siege. And it's born out of reality. First, it was the Mongols, and then others from the stands that attacked what was the nascent Russia 1,000 years ago. In 1812, France marched all the way across the European continent and tried to conquer the Russian Empire and failed. In World War II, the Germans rolled over Eastern Europe and tried to destroy what was then the Soviet Union. So there's a good basis for a sense of siege, a sense that the world doesn't like Russia and doesn't like a strong Russia. And that ties in with a suspicion of outsiders. Now, a lot of these things are not specific or unique to the Russian psyche. A lot of other countries have them. The United States is suffering from a significant portion of its population being suspicious of outsiders and even insiders right now. There are a lot of United States citizens who have a sense of siege, if not of the country, of their own personal place within the country. So, got to avoid those cultural stereotypes, but they are there. Russia has this historical view, and they see themselves as the heartland, which is political Russia, and then the rimland, which is cultural Russia, and includes countries like perhaps the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, countries next to it that have a strong Russian influence in their own national cultural heritage. Then there's this outer insular crescent, which used to include the Soviet states of Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, the stands to some extent, and then there's the rest of the world. This is a table from 2010. It's from the PDAC report. It's 2008 GDP. And you can see the United States had about 27% of GDP. China was growing. It was up to 6.3%. Russia was down to 1.9% of world GDP. So Russia was greatly diminished. I'll show you data about the Russian Empire in a second. Russia was a greatly diminished economic power. And the government and Vladimir Putin And many Russian people were painfully aware of that. And they were also painfully aware of the extent to which China was growing and growing rapidly right next to it. And one of the misperceptions, which I want to talk about a little bit later, is the relationship between Russia and China, because a lot of people think that they're very cozy, but they are next door neighbors that have a lot of economic and political rivalries that are just below the surface. Estimates and projections from the World Bank and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I think, keys off of that, were that by 2030, the U.S. would be down to 23% of GDP. We're actually probably around 21 or 22% already. So we're losing market share, if you will, even as our economy is much larger today than it was in 2008. Our economy as a percentage of world GDP has contracted. China was projected to be at 15%. It's about 18% already and headed higher, and will probably surpass the United States by 2030. By 2030, maybe sooner. You can see Russia here was projected to get back to 2.8% from 1.9%. So Russia, again, not a good hand of cards that they've dealt themselves, or have been dealt to them, if they want to be suspicious about it and blame the West. Russia has a tough road to hoe. You can see here in 1820, Russia was 5.4% of world GDP, basically tied with France. The French Empire and the Russian Empire were largely about the same size. China represented a third of world GDP, India 16%. Those two countries were half of world GDP. The United States, I'm not sure. I guess we were on the boards as the 10th largest economy at about 1.8% of world GDP by 1820. But Russia has a greatly diminished place in the world, and it knows it. There's a lot of perceptions of U.S. aggression. Russian-U.S. hostility predates the United States as a country. It goes back to colonial times, where we competed for land on the west coast of North America, and we competed on whaling in the North Pacific and trading with natives on both sides of the Pacific. There was rivalry over who would be the friends of the king of Hawaii, who would trade with Japan, who would trade with China and Korea, all the way down to the Philippines. And that was there. And the behavior of the U.S. government really all along, since the Soviet Revolution, has continued that hostility. I won't bore you with the details, but even in the post-Soviet era, we've seen these problems. You can look these things up. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was leaked in 1992 and outlined a U.S. efforts that the U.S. government would take to try to keep Russia on the backs of its heels. Paul Wolfowitz wrote an article in 1998 in which he decried the potential that the Russian government could ever be important on a global basis. He also said that the next government in the United States would have to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein under any pretense. Dick Cheney gave a speech at the Royal Institute of Petroleum in 1999 in which he talked about Russian, what he called hydrocarbon assets, oil and gas. And Dick Cheney worked with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the largest opposition funder of opposition candidates against Putin and his parties in the Duma elections, which landed Mikhail Khodorkovsky in jail after he appeared on the front page of world newspapers, meeting with Dick Cheney, talking about the upcoming parliamentary elections in Russia. So it goes back a long way. And I would make an argument, which I won't today for purpose of time, to talk about how the U.S. government's policies, which have been hostile toward Putin and hostile toward the Russian government gaining power, Putin has played his cards poorly, not as effectively as they might have been handled. He saw that what he did was the only logical reaction to all of those things that I just told you. The U.S. government basically saying we want to unfang the Russian government and keep it unfanged economically and politically. I guess we should talk a little bit about what happened over the weekend, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Some of it's being consciously distributed by the Russian government, by the Wagner Group, by the U.S. government, and by the British government. And some of it's just plain inaccurate speculation. What actually happened, was that Wagner marched on Russia. They, without a shot fired, assumed control of the Russian Southern Military Command in Rostov-on-Don on Friday night. Putin says that he told the troops that were there and at other military bases that the Wagner Group occupied Friday night into Saturday afternoon, that Putin says he told them not to resist, just to stand aside. That's not necessarily clear that happened. Again, truth is the first casualty of war. It is also apparent from videos that we've seen that the Wagner Group was well received as it made its way from Rostov on the southern coast of Russia to within 125 miles. It was 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers in the convoy. It wasn't 25,000 soldiers, as some people said. Some estimates were 5,000. A battalion, combat battalion, is 4,000 people. I don't know if Russian militia people adhere to standard military practices and have 4,000 people in their battalion, or if they used 5,000, but it was 4,000 or 5,000 people in this convoy. They made the point of showing the extent to which they could march on Moscow and not face resistance. They did shoot down one Russian helicopter that was shooting at them. There were reports of a couple other helicopters shot down, but there's no evidence that happened. And they also shot down a Russian military fixed-wing aircraft and killed people there. So it's not clear what exactly happened, and it's not clear what exactly is going to happen going forward. The Russian government and military has said that Wagner militia members may sign contracts and, in essence, join or come under the control of the Russian military. Wagner says that only about 1 or 2% of its people have been doing that. It's not clear the extent to which Wagner people are going home, quitting Wagner and going home, or staying with Wagner and resisting joining the military. There's just no clarity on that right now. Yevgeny Prigozhin is in Belarus, and both sides have apparently expressed the view that they are not beholden to the terms and conditions under which Prigozhin and Wagner Group stood down on Saturday. So it's not over. The Wagner march on Moscow proved the extent to which the Russian government and Russian military are vulnerable, not only to them, but to others. And it also proved the extent to which the Russian military has a lot of problems. And it demonstrated the local support that they found en route as far as they went to Lipetsk at the time. A couple things other. Putin doesn't want to rebuild the Soviet Union. Putin wants to rebuild Tsarist Russia. That's why if you look, when you see him, it's an old Tsarist flag behind him. It's not the Soviet flag. They do use the Soviet flag sometimes. But behind Putin, it's the Tsarist flag that is there. He wants to rebuild the Russian Empire, which included the Pale of Settlements that stretched all the way into Western Poland and had that buffer there. Another thing is, and I mentioned this earlier, the ties that bind China and Russia and India and Saudi Arabia and all those other countries, they're not nearly as tight as some people would think. A lot of these are either unequal partnerships or they are friendships of convenience, and they can go away very quickly. Another thing is, don't underestimate the Machiavellian capacities of Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. He's fighting for his independence. He has relied on Putin and Russia to stay in power, and he has to continue to rely on Russia and Putin to stay in power for now. Putin has been pressuring him for years to reincorporate Belarus into Greater Russia. He's resisted it because, hey, that's his job to be president of Belarus, not to be the governor of Belarus. So he plays all sides. He's gone to China in the last few months. He's gone to Kazakhstan. He's gone to Saudi Arabia. He's been around, and I think that people will underestimate him. You saw that on Saturday when people were doubting that he could have put together the temporary agreement for Wagner Group to stand down and return to Rostov-on-Don and then return to the Ukraine. So I think you have to give due respect and consideration to the autocratic leaders, not only of Belarus, but also Kazakhstan. In early 2022, there were protests against the autocratic government in Alekhan Smailov, is the premier of Kazakhstan. And he relied on the Soviet government, Putin, a Russian government, and Putin, sending in Russian paratroopers and riot police and soldiers to restore order and keep him in government. That doesn't mean that he's a really great friend of Putin and that he wants to reincorporate Kazakhstan into Greater Russia the way Putin wants. It means that he's relying on him for now. And he's kind of nervous because if Putin goes away, he's not quite sure what's going to replace him. What probably will replace Putin will be a new government that will be even more hardline against the world. Will continue to feel that the Russia is under a state of siege from the West, that will have Finland, Sweden, and Ukraine as NATO right up upon their border, and will be facing a lot of other political, economic, and financial problems exacerbated by the war against Ukraine and the diminution of Russia's political stature, economic power, resources, and military due to the war. So we're looking at a Russia that will be weaker and poorer and even more angry going forward. What's that mean for metals? Well, the Russian government will continue to buy gold and use gold as a significant portion of its monetary reserves. It won't have a lot of power in the gold market. Russia will probably continue to allow its platinum group metal producers and refiners to export metal because they'll need the foreign exchange. And because even throughout the Soviet era, the Russian and Soviet policy was always to be a good supplier and to decouple economic programs, separate metals exports and policies from international political issues. And they're probably going to continue that. They'll continue to welcome foreign investors into Russian mining operations, and foreign investors will continue to be extremely cautious about doing that. Bigger issues and the bigger impact will not be what Russia does, but the fact that the deterioration of Russia's stature in the world and the political uncertainty and unrest and change that will occur in Russia is part of this ongoing long-term change and shift in international politics and economics. I've said it before, I'll repeat it again. In November 2000, CPM Group issued a gold buy recommendation. We said that the economic, political, and financial environment will be more hostile than it was in 1978-79 when gold went from $190 to $850 and back down, and silver went from $5 to $50 and back down. You had 2 or 3 years of extremely hostile period of time. Soviet troops in Afghanistan, American hostages in Iran, a quadrupling of oil prices, oil embargoes, interest rates shot up to 21%. You think 6%'s high? You think 5%'s high? It was 21% in early 1980 when gold hit $850. You think inflation was high at 9% and now at 6%? It was, I think, 14% back then. But it was a 2 or 3 year period of tough times. We are now 25 years into a period of even tougher times, and it's been one crisis after another. And the next 25 years will be a continuation of that. And in that environment, investors and central banks will continue to turn to gold and silver as a portfolio diversifier, safe haven investment, a form of currency diversification, an inflation hedge, a hedge against domestic and international political problems. We've seen an upward shift in the investment demand curve over the last quarter centuries. What CPM Group said in the year 2000 would be a gold renaissance. Investors, followed by central banks later, we said, would rediscover the value of having a greater portion of their wealth in gold and in silver. And that has happened over the last 25 years, and it's going to continue probably for the next quarter century at least. And what's gone on in Russia is just a chapter in this longer transition to a different world. It's not going to be the world that certain people within the U.S. government and society would like to see. And it's not going to be the world that people in Russia and China would like to see. Hopefully it'll be something in between. And hopefully a lot of people can learn to pivot away from hostility toward cooperation. In that environment, investors and central banks will continue to buy gold, and investors will continue to buy silver, and the prices will be strong. They're not going to be $30,000 gold, but there might be $2,500 gold. That's all I have. Sorry I went on so long. Russian history and politics are interesting to me, and they should be interesting to everybody else. Take care. Take care of yourself and those around you. Keep an eye on the world, and see what you can do to help us. Talk to you Friday.